for people who don't know, is the sort of anarchist direct action green organisation network in this country. Yeah, he found about that through the Earth First gathering in 1997, and he also through a lot of people who'd been involved in the anti-roads movement of the first half of the 1990s. And the anti-roads movement was absolutely sort of critical in the direct action campaign, because that campaign was winding down, and you had a whole group of extremely experienced campaigners and people doing really hardcore direct action in the anti-roads.
Are you talking about the same Olaf that used to work for Corporate Watch?
I think he did work for Corporate Watch for a while.
I know
Yeah.
what you mean.
And there was the Green and Common women too. They joined.
Oh, did they? I didn't even know about.
You remember the lady? There was a company who patented the human umbilical cord, and they were a London-based company. And one of the Green and Common women, who had a shaved head, she was also pregnant, massively pregnant. What they did was they went into their offices, and she drew a barcode on her tummy. And she stood out on the balcony like this and waved at everybody, and all the Fleet Street photographers made a field day of it, and then they rescinded the patent the next day.
Anyway, so Olaf was part of that generation of activists who, I mean, I should say now, I've really been trying hard over the last few months to get more of those people here, and I'm rather sad that it has to be me giving you this story, because I really I was only involved in one or two bits of direct action myself, and most of the time in that period I was publishing this little newsletter. Some of you who were around at the time will remember it. In fact, yeah, I was starting publishing those lists of GM field trials in 1993, but not in anything like that. I never got all the detail that you got, Jim. But I kind of knew that it was important for people to know about that even in 1993. But I could never guess what was really going to become of making those locations public. Anyway, so yeah, so all back to Olaf. I mean, he lived down in Totnes, which turned out to be a really key sort of node for the network. It's a kind of one of those radical green alternative-y type places, and had a very strong activist community. And I can't remember exactly which company it was made the rather stupid mistake of setting up a GM trial site just across the river from Riverford Organic Farm, which is, you know, one of the biggest organic farms in the country.
Guy Watson.
Yeah, exactly. Actually, I still get his veg boxes. Yeah, so that was pretty stupid of them. So you had this activist community there on site down in Totnes, and so that galvanised, you know, massive local resistance. There was rallies, and then eventually, what happened was that this was one of the first really big sort of
actions
on decontamination of a GM trial site in the August of '98, and 15 to 20 people were arrested, including Jacqueline Sheedy and Liz Snook, and they were threatened with £500,000 of damages. And so, of course, there was a massive campaign and solidarity campaign, and the charges, they dropped the charges 3 days before the case came to trial, and that kind of set up quite a pattern for the rest of the campaign. That it became clear that the company's policy, certainly Monsanto's policy, was to keep a low profile as possible and get as little bad publicity as possible. And so a lot of these cases where people got arrested, the case never came to trial, basically. And then there were a bunch of cases where the thing did come to trial, and people were found innocent on the grounds that they were taking action to decontaminate something which, for the greater good, which was thought to be a public health risk and an environmental risk. and that was a sufficient defence. So that event in Totnes was really important. Then later on they started these things called the farm scale trials, which were supposedly scientific trials to prove, what the environmental impacts of growing GM
that was a
crops.
government-sponsored one.
They were
by
sponsored.
the Blair government.
Exactly.
Yeah.
That was in '99 and 2000. Those trials. One of the big ones was at a place called Watlington in Oxfordshire, model farm in Watlington, and that was a rather interesting case where there was a big rally. People organised a big rally, and it so Olaf told me it coincided with a day in which there was also a big animal rights event about 10 miles away. So the police public order unit was chosen to focus on the animal rights demo. So there were only a few police there. So they had several hundred people there and like 2 coppers. And so they held the rally, and then while the police were looking the other way, everybody just marched into the field and just trampled all over it. And and then later on the police public order unit turned up at the end and started arresting people and beating people up. But by that time the damage had been done. I'll just mention another very big famous one was at Ling in Norfolk. This was again a farm scale trial. Peter Melchett, the head of Greenpeace, who happened to be a local farmer nearby, decided with the help of Greenpeace activists and so he actually took his tractor into the field and the farmer found out pretty quickly, but they managed to destroy about a quarter of the crop. We know these were really big fields we're talking about here. And eventually, again, Peter Melchett and all the Greenpeace people there were found not guilty on the grounds that they acted in the public interest.
And the Pink Castle as well.
Yes, why don't you say something about the Pink Castle?
Oh, well, the Pink Castle was, I haven't thought about how to say it. It was up. Yeah, it was basically a bunch of activists, Liz and others, and they erected give it a Google, a great big structure on stilts in the form of a pink castle, and I think it was somewhere outside of Weymouth, was it, in Dorset?
Somewhere in the south.
And they got squatters' rights in this pink castle. They set up a radio station so that people could tune in every day and listen to what they were doing and how they were doing it. Basically, what they were doing every day was decontaminating the trial site before it was growing. So they were picking the seeds out of the ground. There's a video online that you can watch if you Google Pink Castle GM crops or something like that. They were picking the seeds out of the ground every day, and at the end of the day they were posting them back to DEFRA and not putting a stamp on them, which meant that DEFRA had to then pay to get their own seeds back. And if they didn't pay, then they became the property of the post office because they didn't have a return address on them, which was all quite funny. And then the reason I mentioned it was because that was a similar situation. They were all arrested eventually, and I think it was Sherborne Police Station. They were tried in Sherborne Police Station, and they were found not guilty on that, the greater good, which I understood at the time was similar to if a fireman breaks down a door on a house, he can't be arrested for criminal damage because even if the people weren't being threatened by the blaze, he did it because he felt, for the greater good, that he felt that there was a threat, regardless of whether or not that threat was really not. And then, of course, they were supported by the Greater Movement, who had a big pink banquet outside of the police station with big pink candles and big velvet tablecloth, and the children were on their little hobby horses, and I think Greenpeace guys turned up with their tuxedos, and everybody was wearing these big old-fashioned ball gowns, and it was a proper a banquet outside of the police station, and it got quite a lot of media attention.
Yeah. I think
Because they were, and the idea was that they were guardians of the British countryside, and they were the heroes, which of course they were.
I mean, I think that's just an example of how incredibly inventive, actually, a lot of the direct actions were. No mention of no story of the GM campaign would be complete without a mention of genetic snowball, which was Rowan Tilley was the person who main key person in that network. Basically, whereas a lot of the Korean trials were pulled up in the middle of the night by groups of people using Jim's six-figure grid references. What Genetic Snowball decided to do was to be as open and public as possible about it, and they would write letters to the farmer in advance saying, we're going to come and pull up your crop, we really don't like it, we'd advise you to take it away first. And then they got people to sign a pledge saying, I'm going to do this, I'm going to just pull up one plant. And the idea was to snowball and increase the numbers. It was quite controversial. There were a lot of arguments about it amongst the anarchists who thought it was it was a waste of time and that it undermined what they were doing, and there were various rows. But in the end, it proved a pretty good tactic. They ended up going to court practically every week of the year. In fact, I've got a nice picture in one of these copies of the newsletter I used to edit, which has, on one hand, it has a picture of them in their biohazard suits, and then there's a picture of them outside the court where they're wearing very lovely, sort of pretty Middle England frocks, basically, for their court appearance. Anyway, but so that was Genetic Snowball. Again, it's incredibly effective tactic, so what Olaf sort of mentioned to me and it kind of crystallised, went very nicely for me in terms of the story of the whole campaign, was that as Jim said at the beginning, there were lots of companies doing lots of things all over the place, and it narrowed down, partly due to the pressure that was put on those companies, and it would narrow down to just a few of the big companies were left, still trying to do field trials, and that what the campaigners realised was that the really crucial trials for stopping these things actually coming to the market were the national seed listing trials. You had to you have to do trials to prove the characteristics of your variety before you can put it on the market, and if that doesn't happen, then you can't market it. Full stop. So they really focused and targeted on those, and eventually it got to the point where in about 2001, 2002, about 80% of all the trials were being done by one company, Bayer. And so there was a big campaign targeted on Bayer in that year, including occupying their offices and, knocking over their stall at the National Potato Fair and all kinds of stuff. And eventually, in April 2003, Bayer just withdrew all its trials, and that was basically it. The campaign had basically at that point won, and there were no trials at all in the UK between 2004 and 2007. And I think it was quite interesting. Nobody, in 2000 to 2001, nobody realised just how close to the edge the seed companies were on that. And so when that happened, and it was like, oh my God, we've won, but everybody was kind of a bit shocked, really. But Yeah, so that was kind of the end of the story of the campaign.
I think it might be important just to mention at this stage in the discussion that Michael Meacher, who often gets bad press for being the Environment Minister who authorised the trials, actually I think a lot of us knew at the time. I mean, he told me it was like being shot there and then, or having your limbs sawn off, and that he did actually suggest and authorise the GM crop trials, the farm scale evaluations, as a delay tactic in the hope that they would throw something up, which they did, so that as a way of trying to prevent the government from going full scale ahead with commercialisation. And I think it's quite important when we talk about the government, and Michael Meacher was the Environment Secretary at the time, I think it's quite important that we put his actions into context.
Very true, definitely.
Especially because, you know, he died a few years ago, and he was actually very, very supportive. I know he came to GM3's meetings, he's very, very supportive. And I think it's important that we don't just label him as being the government minister that authorised these trials.
But you know, Michael Meacher was actually working against Blair.
Yes, that's right. That's what I'm trying to say. I didn't say that.
Right. At one stage, he was going on telly saying, "There's nothing wrong with GM. I'd give it my children. We you know, whatever." Right. So then Greenpeace dumped 20 tons on the end of Downing Street. Right.
With a placard.
Do you want that, Tony?
Do you remember what the placard said?
No.
They had a placard which said, "Tony, don't swallow Bill's seed."
I know. Right, great stuff.
No, the first commercialisation of GM crops in the UK were penned in to start in 1998. It was only with Michael Meacher's intervention to conduct the farm scale evaluations that basically shelved that.
Sorry, perhaps I didn't articulate
and really
it very
saved the day.
Yeah.
They could not, until those farm scale evaluations were complete, there could be no commercial grain. And at the end of the farm scale evaluations, of course, 2 out of the 3 crops that were trialled failed the test, and the canola, which kind of passed, the company didn't want to go ahead anyway because they were going to be, what the excuse they made was that they were out of date. This was a shot on LL.
That's right.
Yeah.
And he said he didn't know anything about GM before he sat next to Michael Antonio.
Yeah, I remember the day. I can give you a
and
story
he said,
about that if you want.
I buy it. That it's wrong. From their influence.
But I mean, within 2 weeks of those evaluations, they increased the safe distances for bees from, I think it was 50 metres to 1.5 miles or something. That's because they found GM pollen that far from the site, the let-off site. So,
and also the other thing that happened in those trials, it made the headline. It was the headline in the national red top papers, were that 14 of those government farm scale evaluations were announced to have been contaminated with an antibiotic resistant marker gene, which was illegal, which was unlicensed and thus illegal for use in the UK, which kind of makes a mockery of the industry and governments combined can't even trial a GM crop. How on earth could we let them have full scale commercialisation?
The other thing that should be remembered at this time, because I mean, as you said, farm scale evaluations trials started in 1998 and finished in 2004, but the results started coming out, and it's pretty clear after the first year pilot that things were not going the way of industry. But the other thing that happened at the same time is the Cabinet Strategy Unit, Cabinet Office Strategy Unit, started a major study on the science of the GM crops and contamination, and the commercial value for UK agriculture. And they concluded, again, the results started coming out at that time, 2003. That's my organisation was the only anti-GM body at our position. We were the only ones arguing against at the start of the process. By the end, everybody unanimously joined in. Everyone joined in the conclusions. In terms of the science, there was a real problem that we didn't understand the environmental implications, and in terms of the commercial argument, the conclusion was there was no commercial value in growing GM crops in the UK. A very clear result from the Cabinet Office strategy unit. So those things are not just the actualist trials, but actually from within the establishment, the farm scale evaluation and this Cabinet Office report came together all at the same time, and that basically cut the ground out from the industry.
Yeah. I mean, I'll just finish off for time.
Just very quickly say,
okay,
and of course at that time there was the formation of the 5-year freeze.
Yes. Well, that leads me into I'm just going to say 3 very quick things before we finish this session. I mean, Jim and I have focused, and I'll have focused a lot on the direct action on the trials, but the really amazing thing about the anti-GM food campaign was that it was not just these crazy people with dreadlocks pulling out crops. That it really became totally Middle England bought that. We had the Women's Institute on our side. Olaf told me about one.
GM Freeze had 250 member organisations at one time, I think.
Including a bunch of companies who wanted to show how green they were. Olaf told me a nice story about one, tea in a village that was where there was a trial site nearby, and the local WI organised a nice tea party for everybody interested in this, and they had the WI sitting in the same room with the sort of black bloc anarchists, drinking tea together. It really did, opinion polls, immediately started to show that majorities of the country thought GM food was a bad thing. All these huge organisations came on board. And the great thing about the campaign was that the anarchists and the big NGOs and even the WI were all able to work together in a complementary way and didn't get in each other's way and tread on each other's toes, and that was really what made it the powerful campaign that it was. And the other bit of that was, of course, it was about food, so it was about our supermarkets, and so people would do actions at supermarkets where they go into the supermarket with and sort of take every product that might have GM food in it, shove it in the trolley, go to the checkout and start talking to the cashier. I'm a bit worried about this stuff. I mean, can you assure me that it's safe for my children? And you have 10 people doing that in your supermarket, and that shuts down the place for a while. And so the result of that was that already in 1998 we had the first one, I think, or maybe it was 99. Iceland was the first company to say we're going to keep GM crops out of our own brand products, and the pressure just built up through all the mainstream organisations to basically keep GM out of food products, and eventually, of course, it got to a tipping point where enough of the supermarkets had said they would do that all the other ones looked bad, and so they had to do it too. So that was a major victory for the campaign. The final thing I just want to mention in terms of the history of the campaign was really, really important. Was one about probably 10-minute section on a documentary film about GM food, a scientist called Arpad Pushtai, who had done some research with feeding GM crops to rats and GM potatoes, thank you, to rats, and showed that they had some funny effects on the guts. I can't remember what it was.
Leptins, wasn't it?
Sorry?
What was it, leptin?
Yeah, the GM potato had an insecticidal protein derived from snowdrop called GNA.
Yeah.
And the effects were most obvious in the intestine, where there was excessive growth, but there were also internal disturbances to the immune system as well. And this was only after like a 12-day feeding period, so very rapid effect.
And it was very interesting. It was amazing. Once you could really, people could see, oh my God, this is something that really might affect my family and my child. That had a huge impact on national opinion. And it was also a very interesting object case in which this guy was a fellow of the Royal Society of Edinburgh. He was real, world famous scientist, and the Royal Society and the scientific establishment absolutely took him to the cleaners, kicked him out of his job. It was really horrific. But that small section on that documentary, was very, very powerful. Anyway, so yeah, I think for time, I'm sure lots of us have got other anecdotes of that period of the anti-GM campaign, but I think we should probably pause now and have a quick break. There's some tea over there, and then we'll have to come back quickly because we need to move along with the schedule. So, okay.